for the Hatfield Historical Society, and has written for the Historical Society's website and blog Bird by Bird. So I'd like to welcome Deb. Take it away.
Thank you. Tonight we'll be discussing how to create a research locality guide. I'm approaching this topic using a genealogical focus. However, you can use the same principles with any kind of historical research project. Technical difficulties already. Okay, here we are. As Kathie mentioned, this is a part of a larger project of presentations. And in addition to the grants that Hatfield is very good at getting, I would also encourage your donations to the Hatfield Historical Society to keep programs like this available. So what we're going to learn today is how to create a research locality guide. Why you would create such a guide, what topics you would include in such of a guide, and where to find information for your guide. So I became aware of this research tool earlier this year. Previously, like many people, I'm sure you bookmark your favorite website links, and that is a great way to organize your websites. But what is even better, I found, is to have this locality guide, which will be a document that contains all of your links in one document. And you can categorize it with different categories of information that you might want to research for your project. So part of what I do when I start a new genealogical research project is the planning. So the planning takes many, many hours to decide what you're going to research, when you want to research it, what time period you're going to cover, what individuals you're going to research. And previously, I would just hit the ground running and not really have a plan in place. But before embarking on my recent research project of the descendants of William Alice of Hatfield, I wanted to do this guide to really focus on what research tools, what records were available, what kind of information was available. This is especially important with colonial research because of the time period. So when I started creating this guide, I started to think of all the different information that I would need and what would be available, what records, what county I have to look in, what town I have to look in, and having all that organized in one tool and assembled in one place helped me to research more efficiently. So how are we going to create our guide? The first thing I like to do is start off with some background information. Now, if you're researching a location that you've never researched in before, such as a new state, then you would want to have a lot of information on the state, when the state was formed, what kind of counties are in the state, and so forth. I'm familiar with Massachusetts research, so I kind of skipped over a little bit of that and focused really on the town of Hatfield. And when was the town formed? What county was it in? When was the county formed? And at what level would the records be held, whether it's town or county or state? And when does the record keeping begin? And are there any record loss? So record keeping of vital records in Massachusetts was kept as soon as really the Commonwealth was formed. So original vital records are held by the town clerks, and that goes back, like I said, until the county was formed, the Commonwealth was formed. State registration of records began in 1841, and town by town compliance of the state registration varies by town. Land records are held at the county level, and probate records are held at the county level. Hampshire County was formed in 1662, and when it was formed, Hampshire County really covered the whole western half of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it was the seat of the first settlements in the region. Hatfield was settled in 1660 and incorporated in 1670. It was set off from Hadley. So as far as doing colonial research, I would look in both Hatfield and Hadley for some of those records. Where are we going to find background information? We can first go to the town of Hatfield and the Hatfield Historical Society. The Massachusetts State website has a lot of early history of Massachusetts, and also town and regional history books, which we'll discuss a little bit later. The next thing I like to do is look at a map of the area, and that will give me some context as to the towns, what bodies of water existed, did the town or the county borders change over time, did one town split off from another, did two towns merge, and how did those changes impact where the town or the county boundaries were, might impact where the records are kept. So that's important to note. In this map from 1794 of Hatfield, you can see the Connecticut River plays a big part on the boundary. And if you look back in some of the historical records as to why Hatfield was formed and set off of Hadley, one of the major reasons cited was the difficulty in crossing the Connecticut River to go to church services. Here's a close-up of that 1794 map. You can see the houses depicted and even the church steeple. This map from 1830 is an excellent map because it's more topographical in nature. So again, it shows a lot of the farmlands, it shows the Connecticut River. And the map maker even drew little boats on the Connecticut River, as you can see depicted in the blow-up. And also there's detail on the map as to where items were, such as buildings. And here is a depiction of the sawmill. Later maps are interesting as well. Here's a map from 1915. It's a fire insurance map. So these maps are more commercial in nature, where they are showing buildings and schools and churches and public buildings. But this is a private business, the Porter Machine Works Company, which was mentioned earlier in the intro. But what's interesting about this detail on the map is it gives you some insight as to what the building was, as far as how it got its power was water, its heat was steam, the fuel was coal, it did have electric lights, and it also had an automatic sprinkler system, and it had chemical extinguishers. So I think that's all very interesting because you wouldn't think about those things in 1915, especially the automatic sprinklers. Here's a map of Hampshire County showing all the towns in the county. This very detailed map has depicted a lot of different pictures of historic buildings. These maps are of great interest to genealogists because, as you can see from the close-up, it does show where residents lived. So that is a great way to place your ancestor in the context of the town that they lived in, especially these early maps and this map being between federal census years. It's nice to be able to have that information to find your ancestor. There's a lot of great places to find maps online. There's the David Rumsey Map Collection, Digital Commonwealth, which I got a few of these maps from Digital Commonwealth. The Family Search Research Wiki has a lot of listings of where you can find maps. Library of Congress has maps, and Boston Public Library has maps. Town histories are a great resource. They were published generally in the early 20th century, although largely unsourced, meaning that the author did not cite their sources. They often contain information that's rarely found elsewhere. Some of them even include genealogies of the founding families. And when these books were created, there were some people in town that were interviewed, and they might be telling stories that you're just not going to get elsewhere. It's not going to be written down anywhere. So they're a great source of information. And I usually try to see if there's a town history of the town where my ancestor lived, so I can get a general context of what was going on. Luckily, a lot of these town histories are available because they've been digitized. Some of the larger internet digitization services are Google Books, HathiTrust, and Internet Archive. Those are my three go-to places to find any kind of books that are digitized. And it's just really a great resource. And because they're digitized, they're usually in a PDF format, which means they're keyword searchable, and you can also excerpt a copy if you want to include it in your report that you're writing. Very, very handy. Cemetery records are also a great resource for genealogists. Sometimes the cemeteries were established really as far back as the town being established. Sometimes they were established later. When I'm thinking about finding grave markers, I want to know what cemeteries were established in the town, what documentation exists, are the markers photographed, are there transcriptions of the markers available, and are there listings of burials for which no markers exist. Here's an illustration from the history of Hatfield of the old burying ground. One of the primary sources that genealogists look to is Find a Grave. And these images that are uploaded by people who are interested in preserving that data, and they can take a photograph and upload it to Find a Grave. Sometimes volunteers upload pictures from the entire cemetery, which is very handy. But one thing that you want to keep in mind is sometimes the stone is in quite deteriorated shape, as is illustrated with this grave marker for Henry Dwight, who died in 1732. So this photograph was uploaded in 2014. However, I found the same photograph from the Farber gravestone collection. Now, this photograph was taken probably in the mid-1960s to early 1970s. You can see how the stone is less deteriorated and it's able to be seen. All the writing and the gravestone carvings are clearly visible. So that's one thing to think about, is if you find a grave marker, you know your ancestor is buried in a certain grave site, but the marker may not exist. Well, there might be another image of it, or this transcription of the stone might be in book form. Some of my go-to places for finding cemetery records are Find a Grave, the Farber gravestone collection, and Billion Graves, and the Family Search Research Wiki. And the Hatfield Historical Society has a phenomenal amount of information about the gravestones. Census records. Census records are really a go-to information for genealogists, because it's really one of the only ways you can track the movements of your ancestor. The federal census was established when the Constitution, they wanted to accurately count all the inhabitants so that they could plan how many people are represented in Congress. The federal census is every 10 years, starting in 1790. The census stays private for 72 years. So the last census that was published was the 1940 census. However, the 1950 census is due to be published in April of 2022. Massachusetts had two state censuses, one in 1855 and one in 1865. Sometimes you can find books digitized that have the general numbers of the population. But if you really wanted to see your ancestor's name listed on the census, you would have to look at the actual census record. One thing to keep in mind about censuses is the census taker would usually just go to your house, and they were on your street and they were canvassing the neighborhood. And here's a depiction of a census taker asking questions. If you were not home, they would probably ask a neighbor or somebody else because they were in your neighborhood on a certain day. Here is an example, an excerpt from the 1790 federal census for Hatfield. I was looking for John Alice, who was, you can see next to the red arrow. So the early censuses listed the head of household, so it was listing men, although there were women who were listed if they were in fact the head of household. But these early census records did not have any individual biographical information. Usually you were just listed in an age category. Later censuses, like this one from 1900, have a lot more biographical information. So you see here, you're listed under the head of household, all of the family members are listed, what your relationship is to the head of household, wife, daughter, so forth. This census has information on your birth month and your birth year, and also where you were born. So whether you were born in Massachusetts, you were born in Germany, what your occupation was, and so forth. So this is a great way to find information. We talked earlier about record loss. One of the reasons why you want to create your locality guide is to have a general understanding of what records were available. For example, the 1890 census largely is not available. There are only fragments left because it was burned in a fire in 1921. There are no 1890 general population schedules left for Massachusetts. However, the 1890 veterans schedule is still in existence. There are several places to find census records: Ancestry.com, Family Search, and Heritage Quest. Now, Ancestry does require a subscription, but there are local libraries that have the library edition of Ancestry. The Jones Library in Amherst is one of them. So even if you don't have a personal subscription, you could go to the library and look up the records using their library subscription. Church records are a great source of information. They can contain things like baptisms, births, deaths, any disciplinary actions, marriages. There might even be pew assignments. And if you really want to know all about the records in Hatfield, I would refer you to Peter Thomas's excellent presentation, which is available on the Hatfield YouTube channel. I watched it just recently to remind myself of all the great records that are available in Hatfield. Where would you find church records? Well, you can always go right to the church directly. Sometimes the church might have an assigned person who's an archivist, and they would be able to understand and let you know what records they have access to and have available. I always go to the Family Search Research Wiki. They have lots of great links listed for all the available records in a certain geographic location. Some of those records you might be able to find on FamilySearch.org. You can always check directly with the Hatfield Historical Society and the town of Hatfield. And UMass Amherst has a great genealogy library, and they might be able to have information on where to find records of the local churches. Court records, it's nice to know where you can find court records. Again, the courts might be in districts based on your county, or it depends on what kind of case it is. In court records, you can find business disputes, criminal actions, immigration records, probate records. People were litigious even back in the colonial era. Probate records are usually a record that genealogists really like to see if they can find a probate record for the ancestor, because that has a lot of great information. For the earlier cases that have been reported in court reporters, you might be able to find those records on Google Books or one of the other internet archives or digitization services. I was just trying to find an example of a court case, and I came across this really excellent court case where the town of Winchton was suing the town of Hatfield because they had a resident who was a pauper. And in this time period, if you were a pauper and could not afford your own upkeep, you were a charge upon the town. So this individual was a former slave, and they lived in Hatfield and then subsequently moved to Winchton. But what's interesting about this case, which I never actually thought about looking for information like this, it's hard to find information on slaves and who were their owners. And this particular court case, in making its case for how this person moved from place to place, it actually listed all the people that previously owned him. So that was a really interesting case. And Winchton did not win. So. Immigration records. If your ancestor came to this country, you might be able to track their movements based on how they arrived. For many colonial research, we might have books listing the early immigrants to New England. There are several books available. There are several scholarly institutions like the Mayflower Society who track all the descendants of the Mayflower individuals. And those books are available, and all of the descendants are available. They're called the Silver Books, and they are a great, great resource. But for people who arrived later, you might find their name on a passenger manifest, because that was how when they left the country that they were leaving from, their names were on a record on a passenger manifest. And then when they arrived here, they were double checked to make sure that everybody came off the ship. So people came to Massachusetts quite early. So there are passenger manifests that go back to the 1820s. But in addition to the manifests, sometimes this was newsworthy that a ship was coming into a port. It might list the dates of the ship arrival. When is it expected? When did it arrive? It might even list some prominent passengers on the ship. Also, there might be passport applications and, of course, naturalization papers. This excerpt is from an 1820 Boston passenger manifest. You might be able to find your passenger lists on Ancestry and Family Search. Mass.gov has a list of crew lists and passenger lists and where you can find them. The National Archives has a lot of passenger manifests, and also organizations like Castle Garden and Ellis Island have passenger lists that you can research on their websites. Land and property records. They are a great resource to find information about your ancestor. Some of the early deeds even list the person's occupation. You might find out about family relationships in these deeds. You might be able to find fathers giving lands to sons, or if a widow is involved, maybe she inherited the property. So in the land and property records, there could be a mixture of deeds and probate records. There could be bounty lands that you received. And also, unfortunately, because slaves were considered property, you might find some information about slaves in property records. This deed that we are depicting here is from the Hatfield Historical Museum collection, and a lot of their deeds are on Digital Commonwealth. That's where I found this one. And the digitation is very clear, so you can really blow it up and see all the writing very clearly. So luckily, for anyone doing deed research in Massachusetts, there are a lot of records available. So Mass Land Records has digitized 1924 to current. But if you want something older than that, Family Search has got most all of the Massachusetts land records digitized, going back to 1620. So that is searchable on their website. And for items that aren't yet indexed, they are still digitized. You just have to search by county and by town. And then what they have done is they have photographed the old indexes that were in the different counties. So it's not as quick as plugging a name in as most people are used to doing with Family Search or Ancestry, but it's still very easy to find, and it's wonderful to see these old deeds. Military records, great resource for genealogical study. In a military packet, you could have a variety of things. You could have information on bounty land. There could be information on enlistments and discharges. There could be draft card information, muster rolls, receipts, pension information, all kinds of great information from a genealogical standpoint. So when creating your locality guide, you would want to know where you can find these military records. And it's also helpful to understand how, like, what war possibly could your ancestor have fought in. So in order to understand that, I found this great chart that's on Family Search. And it lists all the major wars for this area, the duration of the war, and what typically would be the year of birth for the man who might have fought in that war. And that's very, very helpful, especially with the French and Indian Wars and the early colonial wars, to try to determine what war you might be finding records about. Pension records have a wealth of information. Here is an excerpt from a pension application for Asahel Wood, who was a former enslaved person owned by Alicia Alice of Hatfield. So this was an affidavit that was in his pension record, where somebody who personally knew him is certifying to all that's concerned that he knows this person, he fought with him, he was a colored man, he was in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And these pension records have all kinds of information from a genealogical standpoint, because they would have affidavits, they might have birth certificates, they might have marriage certificates, all kinds of information, because in order for the government to ascertain the service, they would collect these affidavits. So this is a wealth of information. And it is very helpful to be able to place your ancestor to make sure you have the right person. You can track their movements based on these affidavits to understand what battles they were in and what service they are claiming the pension upon. Luckily, there's a lot of great resources to find military records. There's American Ancestors, Ancestry. You can find digitized books that might be regimental histories. Family Search, Fold 3 is kind of carved itself out as a go-to place for military records. Google Books has digitized regimental histories and other information. And if you wanted to just get a general background about each war or each battle that your ancestor might have fought in, you can look at contemporary accounts and you can look at current books that are about that event. I love looking at historical newspapers. Historical newspapers have a wealth of information. In addition to genealogical information, you can get a general sense of what was going on in the town, what kind of businesses they had, what kind of business was conducted, what kind of news did they think was worthy and eventful at the time. I've seen military appointments listed in newspapers. The local clergy might be appointed, business advertisements, farms for sale. I found one of my ancestors once. I was able to place him in a certain location because he had an advertisement for his farm for sale. Sometimes land transfers are in historic newspapers. Local disasters like floods and fires, businesses that might have burned down would be in a newspaper. Probate and other legal notices. And then sometimes birth, marriage, and death records, obituaries, and so forth would be found in newspapers. One thing to keep in mind with newspaper research is not to just look where you think it's going to be, to just widen your search. So in 1744, Elisha Alice lost his home to a fire. Now you would think that this would have been posted in the local newspaper, perhaps in Greenfield. But in fact, I found this notice in a Boston newspaper. But having this kind of information just gives an insight into this person's life. So his house burned down and he lost all of his tools and other things. But because he lost joiner's tools, then that gave you some insight as to his occupation. The house was also listed as being new, and further research into Elisha Alice, he actually got married later in the year of 1744. So perhaps he had built a new house in anticipation of his upcoming marriage. There are a lot of places to find historic newspapers. The American Antiquarian Society in Worcester has one of the largest collections in New England for all kinds of historic newspapers. The Boston Public Library has an online digital access to newspapers. There are some subscription services like Genealogy Bank and newspapers.com. And the Library of Congress has an excellent resource called Chronicling America, and that has historic newspapers. If you go on the Library of Congress website under the Chronicling America section, one thing I like is they always post newspapers of what happened 100 years ago today. So they change that every day. And it's really interesting to see what life was like 100 years ago. Probate records, we mentioned a little bit earlier when we were talking about court records, but they are an excellent way to find information about your ancestor. So you would definitely want to know where you can find probate records and if they've been digitized or if the probate court actually has them physically and you can go look at them. Probate records have a variety of information, such as who was appointed an administrator to administer the estate, what kind of distributions were doled out. Maybe there's information about a widow and what her dower estate would be, guardianships for minor children, probate inventories. When someone died, there would be an inventory of everything they owned and a value would be placed upon it. And these probate inventories are very detailed, and they really give an insight into what kind of artifacts someone owned during their lifetime. There might also be some land transfers in probate records. The settlement of the estate might be listed, and of course the wills. And what's great about the wills is sometimes they're very, very detailed, and they list everybody by their first name, their middle name, their last name. They might list children, they might list grandchildren. So it's an excellent way to make family connections, because sometimes it's very difficult to find a female's surname. Once she's married, she is always known by her married name. But if she is listed in a will from her father, he might list her with her married name, and then that would connect those two individuals, because the will might say, my daughter so-and-so who is married to so-and-so. And then that is a way to make those family connections, where otherwise it would be difficult to prove. This is an example of a probate warrant for Elizabeth Dickinson in Hatfield, 1815. This is an excerpt of a probate inventory. So, as I said, this is a record of what you owned, and it's very detailed. So here we have a feather bed and furniture, and it's given a value. But if you look a few lines down, it also lists a turkey feather bed. So again, very detailed. And so we have several feather beds, there's a warming pan, spinning wheels, and so forth. And this is just a small excerpt, but you can see, you know, sometimes they go on for pages depending on how many items they owned. Probate records for Hatfield would be in Hampshire County, and those records are available on American Ancestors, Ancestry, and on Family Search. And again, it's usually a great way to find information and to confirm those family connections that are difficult to find otherwise. Vital records are the cornerstone of genealogy research. So for each individual, we always want to find their birth information, their marriage information, and their death information. And as stated before, these early records are held by town clerks at the town level. That is how Massachusetts has always recorded them. So you should always be able to go to the town itself and find the information. And even when they did state registration, there's usually a copy held at the town level. Peter Thomas has recently digitized all of Hatfield's vital records, and that is listed on the Hatfield Town Clerk's website. So here is a small clip for one of the original pages of the Hatfield Vital Records book. When you're looking at early records, you need to understand if you're looking at an original record or a derivative record. So here's an example of that. On the top part of this screen, you will see an original record from Hatfield's Town Records. So you can see the colonial style handwriting, the spelling that has not been standardized. So it's not B-O-R-N, it's B-O-R-N-E, the different ways that they shortened the months, and so forth. And one thing to keep in mind is spelling was not standardized either. A lot of the spelling was phonetic. So Alice, the Alice family that I was doing research on, now we have kind of standardized that as ALLIS. But here you can see Abigail, daughter of John and Mary Alice, ALLICE. That is in fact the same family, but again, spelled phonetically. So here in the bottom half of the screen, you will see the derivative record. So at some point in the history of the Hatfield Town Clerk's Office, someone decided to go through all of the old records and organize them and make them in a form that's more recognizable and more searchable. So here we see that it is in 1671, everything is listed. But as you can see from the top, it's not listed all cleanly like that. So you have 1671 and then 72 and then 74, and it's all messed up on one page. So having the derivative record is great because it's usually easier to search. But on the other hand, sometimes you really want to go see the original record if it is in fact available. Vital records in Massachusetts, again, we're very lucky to have a lot of vital records that are in digitized forms in the forms of books. So a project in the early 20th century by the New England Historic Genealogical Society was to gather all of the vital records for each town in Massachusetts. So here I have depicted the Greenfield vital records. They're commonly known as the tan books because you can see that was the binding of the book. And most of the vital records are from the inception of the town until 1850. Luckily, Google Books and other digitization services have digitized these books, but they're also widely available at local libraries. Two libraries where I find a lot of these books are the Jones Library in Amherst and the Memorial Libraries at Historic Deerfield. They're also available online, and the information can be searchable at American Ancestors and also Ancestry.com and Family Search. A lot of the repositories that we talked about today are listed on this sheet. Again, if you're researching in Hatfield, one of the first places you should always go is the Historical Society to see what they have that might relate to your research project. And then the other information that we talked about, all the different repositories that commonly have information relating to historical records are listed. So what does this look like as far as your completed guide goes? Well, I happen to do this guide in Evernote, but you can use any kind of service that you like. You can put it in an Excel spreadsheet, you can put it in a Word document, but in order to have it really functional, what I did is put the live links in there. So once I have my document ready, I've got the live links and I can just simply go from section to section, click on the link, and it goes right into my browser. So here's just an example of some of the different categories that we talked about and the links that are available for the places I found the information. So to summarize what we've learned today, we learned how to create a locality guide. And we want to do this because we want to understand the geographic region in which your ancestor lived, and having an understanding of the general types of records that are available for your area will assist you in creating your research plan so you can plan out your project ahead of time. And knowing what records exist will help improve your research efficiency, and it will reduce the probability of you having an experience where you thought you were going to find a record and you didn't find it, which is a negative search result. And also, once you have gone to the effort of making this guide, the next time you research in that area, you have your guide ready. And it's a guide that you can always continually add to. So it's not just a one-time thing. If you find a new resource, you can add it to your guide. And as you become more familiar with different towns in different geographic regions, you can add those towns as well. So now that I have Hatfield, that's in Hampshire County, well, I've already got a lot of the basis for any other town that's in Hampshire County. So that will also allow me to cut back on my total research time once I begin a new project. So for more information on this subject, I have written a brief blog post on how to create a research locality guide, which is on my website. And also the locality guide that I created specifically for Hatfield is available on my website as a free download. And I believe copies might be available also in the Hatfield Historical Society. And there are other resources as well on how to create a locality guide. One that I used was listening to a podcast given by Family Lockett on how to create a research locality guide. And I found that to be very helpful. And I hope you enjoyed our presentation today and that you learned how to create a locality guide and are inspired the next time you do a research project to do a little pre-research and decide if this is something that would help you become a more efficient researcher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. That was fabulous. So much great information. It's like, I feel like my head's going to explode.
Despite my initial technical difficulties, I think I'm back on track.
No, that's really great. So we don't have many questions in the chat. I'm hoping people will ask some. Elena Fowler just wanted to know if there was going to be a recording of this available. And for anyone who didn't hear this in the beginning, yes, we are recording this, and it will be available probably within the week up on the Hatfield Historical Society YouTube channel. And the other programs in the series are also available there or will be available there soon. But also if we'll have the link to Deb's website. Was that link listed on your last slide or anything, or?
Yeah, it's listed there, and yeah, the link is listed. You could just cut and copy it into your browser, and you'll get to the actual document.
Because she has a great website and blog with a lot of interesting posts, and there's a post there that's how to create a research locality guide. So it's kind of a shortened version of tonight's program. So you can always go check that out too. So there'll be a lot of ways to get this information. I have a few questions, but I'm hoping that some of you have some questions. If you've been doing any genealogy work or want to start doing something, any questions that you have for Deb while we have her here tonight? So
one of the questions I saw in the chat was, how much time do you spend making the locality guide? And I would say, because that was my kind of first attempt, I don't remember if I maybe spent like 7 or 8 hours on it. Because just going from place to place and really trying to find how much information is available. I mean, like I said, some of the links I already had bookmarked in my browser. So it was just a matter of kind of cutting it and pasting it into another document. But the time that you spend creating your locality guide, I just look at that as pre-research to my research project. I mean, it's something I would have done anyway if I hadn't have created the locality guide. So it's just something that, like I said, I think it just, now that I've grabbed onto this concept, I'm going to do this for any project that I start that's genealogical in nature, because it just helps you become a more organized and efficient researcher if you can find the information quickly.
Yeah, it seems like it would really, like it would be one of those kinds of things that you'd be like, well, I just really want to dive in and start answering the questions. But my sense is that you would end up saving time in the end by having done this sort of pre-research.
Yes, I agree. That is something that I used to do. I would just say, oh, okay, I'm gonna, my ancestors from Coos County, New Hampshire, I'm just gonna, find him. But really that is, it took like me longer. It took longer for me to, because I would dive right in and I'd say, okay, I found him on the census. Okay, now I know where he lives. But if I had a general understanding of the structure of the county, especially if it's a county you're not familiar with, that you haven't researched in before, to just understand how the court system is, where's the local newspaper, where's the county seat, where would the records be held? Because it really differs from county to county, especially when you're in New England, because all the towns are just so vastly different. But it's really, I think now that I've grasped onto this concept, I'm going to do it for every project, because doing that pre-research, and it also helps you think of things like, what am I going to research? What do I want to learn about my ancestor, and where am I going to find that information? And then just doing that pre-research just makes your actual research a little bit more effective, and because it's time consuming. Any kind of historical research is time consuming. So in order for you to be able to start and stop, you might say, well, today I'm going to do, courthouse research. So that's like my job for today is I'm going to do this. And it's just, having all that information listed in the form of web links is just very, very helpful.
I think, getting stuck down rabbit holes is probably something that all of us experience, and not necessarily, an unhappy place to be. But if you don't have so much time and you're really trying to focus, I'm wondering if this might actually help you not go down as many rabbit holes. Like if you're trying to, find what all the sources are, and then you can look at your questions that you've identified and say, which of these resources am I most likely to be able to answer that question in, than just starting more randomly. I don't know.
I think it definitely helps. I mean, I think everybody who does historical research is prone to running down those rabbit holes, because it's just so exciting about, oh, I found something. And then you're like, especially it's terrible, rabbit holes in historical newspaper research. You find the article that you're looking at, you're like, great. And then you look at the article that's next in the next column, or the article that's above, and oh, well, they're selling flax. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, here's an advertisement for a cider maker, or, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I wonder how many people made cider in the town of Hatfield, and then rabbit holes, definitely. But that's, this locality guide is kind of like step one. And then the next step I would take is doing a research plan. So, and if you have a solid research plan, then hopefully that will keep you on track, so that you're not running off down these areas that you really didn't intend to research.
Okay. All right, so I don't see anyone's hands raised or hear anyone asking a question. So I am going to share my screen a moment here. For those of you that have been on the other programs, this will be a familiar last screen to see, but especially since I forgot to record the beginning of the program where I thanked our funders, I would like to thank our funders again here. This is one of the 6 online programs that are made possible by a grant we have from Mass Humanities, which is funded by the Mass Cultural Council. And this is a grant to help the Hatfield Historical Society build a digital volunteer program. So we're hoping that some of you who participate in these programs might be interested in doing some genealogy research for us. And we'll have more information about that after the end of the next program, which will be on December 2nd. And that will be a program by Liz Denny that is about how to research your house, basically uncovering hidden stories. And she has uncovered an unusual amount of hidden stories about her own house in doing her house as the example of how to research your house. So I think that's going to be a very educational and entertaining program if you'd like to join us for that. Again, the sign up link is either listed on your screen there, or you can go to the events page of the Hatfield Historical Society website. We wanted to thank, of course, our presenter, Deb Blodgett, just for doing a wonderful program. Deb used to live more locally, and she volunteered for the Hatfield Historical Museum. And then she also was our researcher on a different grant with Mass Humanities. That was, she did the research inventory guide for the Porter McLeod collection, and basically inventoried this whole collection of, I forget how many boxes there were, like 30 boxes of records.
Lots of boxes.
Lots
I think
and
it
lots.
ended up being like 32,000 records or something like that.
Right, just an incredible. So that is like a huge, fabulous collection that we have now that's just, you know, ready for more research. And then we did have another grant that got us Professor Bob Forant, who was our scholar in residence. But anyway, we have a lot of great artifacts that we are hoping to get some volunteers to help us dig more into and make connections with. So we thank you all for coming, and we hope you'll join us again on December 2nd for our last program in this series of 6.
Do you want me to say anything?
Yes, and Peter, if you could let us know what you were going to tell us at the beginning of some new things to find.
Well, I've been working in the Registry of Deeds website for Deerfield particularly, but being compulsive the way I am, talking about going down rabbit holes, I basically decided to start with volume 1 and look at every page in the registry. But what I found is that you can access one way or another every deed online. The Deb was quite right about the searchable deeds for Hampshire County, but I also find a lot of Hatfield deeds in the Registry of Deeds for Franklin County.
Really?
And that's one of the things that you ought to consider. Now, there's 3 varieties of 3 avenues into this. If you're looking for things from 1900 on in the Franklin County one, they're searchable by grantor or grantee, and they're very easy to get into. There's also an inventory of grantors and grantees from 1674 to 1974 online. You can click on those and bring them up, and you'll get a complete chronology of all the people with deeds. They won't tell you anything about them, but at least you can follow the deeds through, and it'll give you the book number and the page number in which the deed occurs. There's, in the early part of the time frame for the registry. Now, see, Franklin County wasn't broken off, I think, until 1811 or something like that. So I thought, well, gee, I'm going to have to go to Hampshire County or Hampden County for the early records. Well, not true. I can find any Deerfield record in Franklin County. And what someone did, like the church records in Hatfield, is they did an abstract of every record from 1674 to 1784. And so you can get the grantor of what the deed is about, the date, the page numbers, and the grantee for every deed that was issued. And I'm finding those things just fabulous for tracking individuals and the early settlement of Deerfield, because you can actually track individual lots if you know the links.
To get to the choke.
And then there's a group of people, there's a group of deeds in the middle from 1784 to 1900 that aren't searchable. However, you can actually go into the record books themselves and scan every deed in every record book. And you simply go in and query on the book. If you query on book 13 and you don't actually put a page in the query, it will actually start from page 1 and you can click every page in that particular book.
Wow.
And there are several hundred books. So don't think about it lightly. But anyway, you can one way or another, you can actually get in and look at any deed. Now, these cover not just, Deerfield that I'm working on, but Wendell and Shutesbury and Leverett and, I mean, all the surrounding towns that were settled in that time period. It's fabulous looking at the 1740 and 50 deeds, because there were about 15 brand new towns set up. And there are speculators. One town I looked at in the Berkshires, and I can't remember, it may have been Coleraine or Charlemont, one of those towns. The entire town was actually bought by 3 Boston merchants. And the deeds are for 8,000 acres.
Wow.
And then what they did is they bought the deeds, and then they turned around and sold them off piecemeal to people that wanted to come and settle in those towns. So for a couple of £1,000, you could buy an entire town's worth of territory, and then individual lots were sold off for £50 a piece.
So some things never change, right?
Now, it's a wonderful source of information. The only thing I will tell you is it's taken me 2 weeks to actually figure out the intricacies of how to get from one thing to another and what's in those. So I guess following up on Ded's wonderful presentation here, if people are interested, I would try and put together a presentation on how to navigate the registry deeds.
I would love that.
But if you want to to find them, go into the Franklin County Registry of Deeds, and there's something about 2020 in I can't, well, maybe I can get to it on my let me see if I can. Am I still? Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
All right. Well, I'm just going to try and I'm going to bring up that site. So it's masslandrecords.com/Franklin/default. And then there's a whole bunch of, but if you just simply go into the Franklin County Registry of Deeds, you'll find a link to it.
Okay, well, that's great. And so,
And then what you want to do is go to search criteria, and so you can name search, you can book search, you can document search, you can property search, you can unindexed property searches, 1663 to 1974 grantor index, same thing, et cetera, et cetera. It's a wonderful source of information that I wasn't familiar with, but I just thought I'd pass it along.
yeah, that's great.
The other thing I would tell you is that, and it was really nice to see Deb using the stuff that I digitized for Hatfield, but the Memorial Library in Deerfield, PVMA, Historic Deerfield Library. I've also put the church records for Sunderland, the church records for Whately, the church records for South Deerfield, a bunch of the town records for Deerfield, much like the ones for Hatfield.
So you're saying PVMA has copies of those?
They have the digital versions of all of those records.
Do you know if any of those have been made available online?
They have not.
Not yet. Okay.
No.
And I was gonna ask Deb. So for instance, the vital records from Hampshire County, similar to what Peter's talking about for Franklin. I don't know if have you been in there? Like, is it likewise, we could go in and search on Hatfield and search on deeds from the 1700s in there.
Yes. Yep. I mean, I haven't done it in a while, but that's my recollection. I'd have to check it out.
That they might actually have images of the deeds, or it would just be a record of who to who?
No, they have the images. Yeah, they have the actual deeds. But one thing you got to remember, this is before photocopying. So it is not, someone worked in the town, in the, registry office, and they recopied the deed. So you would bring your deed in to be recorded, and someone would sit there and hand copy it all.
Okay.
So it's not like it's not going to be your ancestor's signature necessarily.
Right. So it's not the original.
It's not the original. It is, but it's contemporaneous. So, but some people didn't record the deeds right away. They just hold on to them because there's no reason to record it unless you're selling the property. It's not like today. It's not like today where you record the transaction immediately. It wasn't like that in the earlier time periods. But another thing, kind of talking about what Peter was talking about, and also I mentioned a couple times during my presentation, remember to look at the boundaries of the town. Your ancestor could have lived in the same place his whole life, but the town changed around him. So for example, there was Whately, that, parts of Whately were annexed to Hatfield, things like that. Your ancestor could always have lived on the same road, but then the times changed, the boundaries changed.
Right. They
So
could have been, I don't remember how far west Hatfield went initially, but they could have been in the western part of the Hatfield lands when it was actually Hadley. And then when Whately separated from Hatfield in 1771, I think it was, then they would have been living in Whately, and then parts of what originally were Hatfield that became Williamsburg,
Well, right, but so that's what I'm saying, that it's have to kind of keep an open mind and look for information on deeds and so forth in all of those towns. And, because say the Alice family, they were from Hadley. Hadley became Hatfield. They did not physically move. They lived in the same place, except it's no longer Hadley, it's Hatfield now. So if you look at the really early records, they didn't physically move to a different street or a different section of town. It's just that the boundaries around them changed. And like New Salem and Shrewsbury and, some of those towns around, Franklin County are the same way. Like my ancestors always lived in Shrewsbury, but then you look at the records and it'll be New Salem is the deed. Well, that's because New Salem was built around Shrewsbury and so forth. And, there are all over Massachusetts, there are just little boundary changes. So you just have to be very aware of that when you're looking for records.
Yeah, absolutely. And Deerfield's a classic case of that. At one point, Deerfield was 30,000 acres, and it included Deerfield, Conway, Ashfield, Greenfield, Gill, all of which broke off. And then in 1813, the legislature decided to take a little southwest corner of Deerfield and give it to Whately. So time becomes when the time period that you're looking for your ancestor becomes critical to know, as Deb says, well, what was the status of that particular geographical location at the time you're trying to find them? Because there are deeds that say Deerfield on them, but then when you read Deerfield, you find out it's a Southwest Division, which became Conway. And so anyway, it gets really complex, but.
Well, that's fascinating. Anyway, I think we'll call it a night here, unless anybody has a final short question or comment. And again, Deb, thank you so much. I don't see you on my screen anymore. I hope you're still here. We hope we'll see a bunch of you on December 2nd, and have a fabulous Thanksgiving break. Everybody stay healthy.